Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Krebs. I am a scholar at the University of Virginia Center for Politics. And today we're going to have a discussion about ongoing threats to democracy. And given that we're just a few weeks away from the 2020 election, which I'm intentionally not calling the midterms because there are gubernatorial elections throughout the country. There are other statewide elections. And midterms doesn't quite do, I think, the peril to democracy that we're facing right now justice. So with that, we have a all-star lineup of a little bit of UVA or a lot of UVA, and then we have some outside partners as well. So let's start with the Honorable Barbara Comstock, who is also a Center for Politics scholar, and in 2009, voters in Northern Virginia sent Barbara to the House of Delegates. In 2014, she won election to the 10th Congressional District, which she represented for 2 terms. And she was named as one of the top 10 most effective lawmakers in the 115th Congress by the Center for Effective Lawmaking. An advocate for women in politics, she established the Barbara Comstock Program for Women in Leadership, which is housed at George Mason University. Currently serves as senior advisor at the law firm of Baker Donelson and is involved with Issue 1 and the National Council for Election Security. Issue 1 is fighting to protect U.S. elections, lessen political polarization, limit the influence of big money over politics, and improve the ability of Congress to solve problems. Next, and we just happen to sit like this, and so well done on the briefing notes, Glenn. Next is Renee DiResta. She's the research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. She investigates the spread of malign narratives across social networks and assists policymakers in understanding and responding to the problem. She has advised Congress, the State Department, and other academic, civic, and business organizations, and has studied disinformation and computational propaganda in the context of pseudoscience, conspiracies, terrorism, and state-sponsored information warfare, and has a storied career in technology and finance before that. So she really found her passion of studying crazy people online. Next, and finally, we have Siva Vaidyanathan, who is the Robertson Professor of Media Studies and Director of the Center for Media and Citizenship here at the University of Virginia. He is the author of Anti-Social Media, How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy, Intellectual Property, a very short introduction, The Googleization of Everything, and Why We Should Worry, Copyrights and Copy Wrongs, The Rise of Intellectual Property and How It Threatens Creativity. And you're very prolific in your writing. The Anarchists in the Library, How the Clash Between Freedom and Control is Hacking the Real World and Crashing the System. Siva co-hosts a successful podcast called Democracy in Danger. So welcome, and thank you for joining us here today. Very timely conversation, as I mentioned. I think what I would like to start with is just kind of my framing of how I see the peril that we're in today, and then tee that off for a series of conversations back and forth across the group. But as I think back to where we've come from 2016, and I just had the pleasure here of speaking to a group about National Cybersecurity Month here in the same room a little bit before this event. And I think about my time in government as the director of the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, which is the lead civil cyber defense agency for the U.S. government, and also was tagged or cursed, depending on how you look at it, with the lead role in protecting the 2020 election and working with state and local officials who are responsible for administering elections. So I think back to 2016 and the efforts that the Russians launched to try to interfere in that 2016 election. It had 3 different components. First was attempts to get into voter registration databases and other systems related to administering elections. The second was targeting and hacking into political campaigns, the DNC, the Hillary Clinton campaign. And the third is this more pernicious, drawn-out disinformation campaign that's really rooted in the entirety of Russian information operation doctrine, going back really a century or more, back to the early 1900s, back into the empire, Russian Empire. And so I've described it as a Sputnik moment, which is a cliched, overused term, but the idea here was, I think for many people, many Americans, it was the first time that cyber and the internet could be used to destabilize democracy, to really get at our institutions of power here in the US. And I likened it to Sputnik moment because in 1957, when the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite, it wasn't the fact that they beat us to space necessarily, it's how they beat us to space. They put it on top of an intercontinental ballistic missile, which would allow them to reach out and touch us with a nuclear warhead in New York, Washington, LA, San Francisco, and elsewhere. And so the geographic distance that separates us as countries was really contracted and compressed down by that ICBM. Same thing in 2016, that realization that the internet brings us closer. It contracts the geographic distance. And the problem is even though we may have realized that in 2016, using the various techniques they did, we didn't necessarily have meaningful responses from 2016 up to 2020, which gave plenty of other opportunities for others, including the Iranians, that did attempt to get in the middle of the 2020 election. And there were domestic actors that saw the playbook run in 2016 and adapted it to their own measures. So that kind of brings me to today, and as I look at the 22 election, I have four main areas of concerns about threats to democracy. The first is the continued delegitimization of the 2020 election. You actually have candidates for office that are almost fundamentally running as a plank of their candidacy that 2020 was illegitimate, that President Biden was not elected president. I'm not saying he's not president, but he wasn't elected president. And that continues to undermine confidence in the process, in elections, and it will affect turnout as well. The second threat is continued attacks against election workers. And so we saw this in 2020. I personally received a number of death threats. I'm sure, Barbara, you've received numerous. And I know Renee and Steve, I'm sure you as well. It's part of, unfortunately, doing business as election workers right now. And that is leading to a retreat, an exodus from the workforce, which in turn kind of turns out to be a form of almost voter suppression. Fewer voters, election workers you have, the fewer people you have to staff precincts. Fewer precincts you have open, the fewer opportunities you have to actually participate in democracy and vote. The third threat is actually the radicalization of election workers, where previously we did not have a concern so much about election workers being turned or part of a process that could overturn an election. Now it's actually an entire strategy to get people that have been radicalized inside the election offices to provide access, as we saw in Coffee County, Georgia, and Mesa County, Colorado, to unauthorized researchers or other workers. And then the fourth and final is all those other three issues create a degradation in political discourse that is not just being taken advantage by domestic actors, but foreign actors can manipulate that information space, just like they did in 16 and have continued. So those are the four big areas that I'm thinking about on a daily basis, and I know our co-panelists have plenty of their own thoughts. So Barbara, why don't we start with you? Just kind of either with that setup or to add to the kind of panoply of threats and risks. What's keeping you up at night these days?
Oh gosh. Well, thank you, and it was great to be here at UVA, and I just want to thank the university for having you here, and I just appreciate so much what a treasure Chris was at the critical time in 2020. I was out of office then, but I was working informally with the National Council for Election Integrity. It was a bipartisan group of former members who kind of came together that summer because we realized all this misinformation was already going on. And we knew whoever won, there was going to be a lot of unhappiness. If you're, I didn't have a guy at that point. I didn't have a team. But whoever won, we knew people were not going to be happy, and there was going to be a lot of, nobody imagined how bad it was going to be. But I think Chris's voice was so important at that time, and I didn't know you at that time. But, and you had COVID and everything going on, but your voice was such a clear, clarion voice for people to look to and to say, okay, this is somebody we can listen to and follow. And I think for all you public policy students here, learn your craft, learn your specialty, because at these key moments, you need to have people who will stand up and do what Chris did. Because imagine if you didn't have a person at that moment who was willing to do what he did. And I think because of what he was willing to do, there were other more partisan, more political people in that agency who might have kind of turned away and tried to do some of the silly things that were being asked of them. If he hadn't been there with his clear voice and expertise doing what he was doing. So I am so thankful for the few people who did say no. Because it is, I think the lessons of 2020 are it really just takes a few good men and women to say no at key points. So I would encourage, one of the things as we look to next month and election days, one of the things I'm going to do is work on election day and be there, because one of the things that I see, I am for the first time in my life a single issue voter. I've never been really a single issue voter. I was a conservative Republican, but now my issue is democracy, and before any other issue. And if you aren't going to respect elections and who wins and who loses, you can't have any other issues, before that. So I think, being there and making sure the elections work, and that we count the votes, and that we respect the system, and at the end of the day, we are going to, have winners and losers, and we are going to concede elections. One of the people who I'm very concerned about nationally, the whole state of Arizona with Kari Lake, and of course that was, the center of 2020. One of the most frustrating things of 2022 is we still haven't stopped having the election of 2020, and all of Arizona is election deniers. And she's already saying she won't accept the election except if she wins. So, those kind of situations are going to repeat themselves throughout the country, and we're a 50-50 country. I won my first election by 422 votes. On election night, as we're sitting there watching the precincts, I knew where I was going to sort of be close and where I was going to win, and I had people who knew my precincts who were calling them in. And, it could have gone either way. When it's 422 votes, did I knock on enough doors? Did I do enough things? And as you're waiting, I was down one vote at one point, then I'm up 50, then you're down 100. And it's going back and forth all night. And then we had to have we did have a recount, but my opponent was gracious enough to concede that night. But, most people, I have found that these people who come with the conspiracy theories and talk to you about that, they've usually not worked at the polls. So if you haven't worked at the polls, you're all here, you're engaged citizens, do take the time. Sometimes you have to do more work to work inside and be there checking off the votes, but you can at least stand outside and watch and be there, and either hand out something for the candidate you're for, and just watch what's going on. These days, people get a little crazy sometimes. They'll get a little anxious, or, start yelling at people. Be there to calm things down and give people, say nice things to people, get them calmed down. But you can work inside also. If you've been trained, you can be there in the morning to, when the machines are opened up and all that. You can work on recounts if there are those. But learn that system if you can, because so many people, and a lot of the people who have been pushing these conspiracy theories are people who've never worked at the polls and don't understand that. Because I stayed on some of these crazy email chains, and some of the people who are national names, whose names you would know, were on them. And on election night of 2020, as they started saying, oh, look, they're stealing the votes in Fairfax County. Oh, look at that. I said, Donald Trump got 29% in Fairfax County in 2016. He is not going to win. Nobody is stealing anything from him. There are no signs in all of Fairfax County for Donald Trump. Don't tell. They're like, oh, well, I know. People were afraid to put out signs. I mean, people were saying crazy things that somehow he had won. And I said, that is exactly the numbers I would expect. You know, and these were people who, you know, had never, just didn't understand anything about retail politics. You know, they were just people who were preaching to the choir, hung out with everybody who thought the way they did, and had never knocked on a door, never had worked at the polls, and just didn't understand it. So get out there and do, and I mean, that's what I'm looking for, is to, because then you can ask them, have you knocked on doors? Did you work on the polls? How many doors did you knock on? What did people say when you asked them? Because then, you know, you're going to catch them in the lies a little bit better there. So just sort of the retail side of it is what
that makes a lot of sense to me. It's actually something I've seen increasingly in the last year or so with a lot of people that kind of regurgitate the 2020 lies, and they either are encouraged to then go work in an election, see how it actually works, or they just go ahead and volunteer to do it, and they come out the other end, they're like, having now seen it on the inside, I know how it works. The security controls, the protections in place would make it really hard for an outsider to come in and steal the election. So I know at least my county or my precinct is secure. Now the other ones are all screwed up, but mine's good. So, and I'm okay with that, frankly, because like I'll take it, you know, foundational step at a time. But I think what you're kind of hitting at here is we just almost have a fundamental misunderstanding or lack of knowledge or understanding about how elections actually work, and it tends to be, you know, people either they vote early or however they vote, but they expect to vote and then turn on CNN, Fox, whatever that night and get the results, never minding the canvas.
And you have to work with the rules you have. People get upset, like, well, I don't like absentee votes. People should vote. We should all vote on the same day. This is I hear from somebody. In my day, we used to all vote on the same day. They said, well, okay, let's consider this 80-year-old lady who's upset that people don't vote all on the same day like you did when you were 20. What happens if you have a heart attack on election day?
Or not only, in the military.
Yeah, or you're well, but not only can you not vote, the doctor who's operating on you now can't vote. Now, I always ask doctors to vote beforehand because I knew a lot of doctors who voted for me. And if they happen to have a patient on election day, I certainly didn't want them to leave the operating room to vote on me, and I wouldn't expect them to. So there's a lot of good, and I knew a lot of business people who voted for me, and if they had the deal of the century that came up on Monday and they had to leave town, I did not expect that they were going to say no and leave. And I often found when I looked through my voter file, oh, gee, I had this big donor, max out donor who didn't vote for me. Well, why? And I'd ask them, gee, why didn't you vote for me? Because somebody called me and I had to go out of town. Well, okay, next time could you vote absentee? So this is why, for example, in Florida, in the villages, everybody votes absentee. So Trump loved that. They voted, you know, they all vote absentee down there. So they all, oh, well, that's my voters. I trust them.
Yeah.
You know? So it is ridiculous when you go through all these things that, you know, it does work. The system works. And so you can knock down a lot of these things when you actually go one by one through them.
And every state's different, right? Not just from how they administer elections, but the demographic requirements, the geographic requirements. You have the state of Washington and even Oregon, you know, massively rural state that uses mail-in ballots, and it works for them. Other states that do not have the same approach because they may be a little bit denser in population. But I think there are a bunch of different questions I think on the whole we'll come back to in a minute. So Renee, you are a part of a group, the EIP through Stanford and working with some other. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you've been doing there, but more importantly, what are you seeing and what keeps you up at night right now in terms of threats to democracy?
Yeah, so in 2020, so I'm at Stanford at the Internet Observatory. One of the things that we wanted to do was try to understand, were there ways to connect different stakeholder types, people who have a real interest in democracy, which we all do, but who have particular areas that they're focusing on. So you have state and local election officials who have to run the election and maintain election integrity. You have academics who are studying how narratives are spreading. We describe a lot of what we do is looking at rumors, right? How are viral rumors impacting elections? When somebody believes that their ballot has been invalidated because they were given a Sharpie marker at the polls, and they remember being a kid in school and being told you can't use a Sharpie marker on a Scantron, and then they believe that there's a vast plot to steal the election from them, because that's kind of where the political climate is in this country at this point. That those claims tend to go viral, and so one of the things that we look at Stanford is how those claims go viral, where among what communities, where on the internet. What are things that are someone who is wrong on the internet with 3 followers versus something that is gaining momentum and becoming a claim that then becomes persistent, that, as the other, as my co-panelists have noted, then actually is now being relitigated again now in 2022, right? Sharpie markers in Arizona are being relitigated again in 2022. So we have civil society also, which recognizes that certain members of particular communities are targeted for either voter suppression efforts or misinformation that is resident within a particular community that maybe another community wouldn't care about. Because of the way that the internet works, you can target messages to particular demographic groups, particular people who are of a certain age, people who are of a certain race, people who are of a certain gender. And so you have these different ways in which civil society organizations that serve those communities observe false and misleading claims taking hold in their communities, and they want to understand where did it come from, and more importantly, what are the facts. So we have civil society, state and local election leaders. Of course, the federal government also traditionally in this country has had a role in ensuring that our elections are free and fair. And then academia, again, which has the capacity to understand how social media narratives move. So these different groups kind of coming together, and then tech platforms is the other group that I forgot to mention, where because so much of the information goes viral on their platforms, they have their own election integrity efforts. And so how do we as observers who can see the entirety of the social media ecosystem engage with them who have visibility and depth into one particular piece of that ecosystem, and how do all of these different people with their different visibilities come together to ensure a free and fair election? So the purpose of the EIP, Election Integrity Partnership, was to bring together a variety of different groups and to create a federated model whereby civil society groups could reach out to us and say, hey, I'm seeing or hearing this thing in my community. State or local election officials could say, hey, I'm seeing this claim about Sharpie markers. Is this just something I'm seeing in my feed because I see the conversation in my particular locale or the people I follow, or is this something that's really in fact a big deal and growing? And so what we tried to do is create this model by which we could do this multifaceted analysis. You're seeing a thing, here's what we think is happening. We can communicate that back to you. If something needs to be communicated to a tech platform, hey, you should look at this. This is beginning to go viral. Here's the fact check indicating it's wrong. Here's the evidence that it violates your policies, et cetera. Perhaps there's a role for platforms to play in that conversation as well. So EIP sought to be this kind of hub and spoke model. Again, the beauty of a federated model is also that if something does turn out to be a bad actor or a partisan actor or somebody who is reaching out with kind of partisan claims, we try to maintain a nonpartisan environment at all times. In a hub and spoke model, you can simply stop receiving or processing tips in that regard. And so there's a way to create these convenings and to say, is this a model for understanding and responding in a cohesive, networked way? Could we say, here's what we see, people in local elections in Arizona, here's where that Sharpie narrative came from, here's where it's going, and then that person who is a trusted counter messenger counter speaks to the people in their communities. They don't want to hear Stanford Internet Observatory thinks that your claim about Sharpie markers is wrong because who the hell are we, right? We're ivory tower academics. We have no trust, we have no resonance in that community. But the local election officials theoretically do because they're members of the community. Similarly, at a federal government level, what Chris's team was doing at the time was writing a rumor control website. Sort of in aggregate, these are the major stories that are hitting kind of a national level as opposed to the ones that we were seeing at a very regional level. So again, the goal of EIP was to create a visibility across a variety of different stakeholder types to understand how election narratives were taking shape. So we ran it in 2020 and we're running it now. And I would have to say what we're seeing now is like a redo of 2020. I mean, it's just, it's at a state-by-state level this time. You know, we don't have quite the same overarching federal, you know, kind of national, I should say, narratives because we don't have a presidential election this year. And so, but what we are seeing is states where there were a high percentage of kind of people who didn't believe in the legitimacy of the 2020 election are not only running candidates that hold that belief, but they're also relitigating the way the 2020 election played out in their state. It's not particularly cohesive. Oftentimes, the people who got elected in the down ballot races somehow argue that the presidential election was stolen, as if like that one race was compromised, but their race was just fine. So we're not seeing, but again, the problem with rumors is we use rumors rather than misinformation because a lot of what happens is somebody makes a claim. There is a suitcase outside of my polling place that must be, they're either taking the ballots away, bringing the ballots there, that's where the CIA supercomputer is, so it's just a photograph of a suitcase, and then somebody picks it up and says like big if true, some random guy's take, and then an influencer picks it up with big if true, and then all of a sudden it's wildly viral. The answer to what is that suitcase actually there for is not something that is knowable in the time in which it is going viral unless there is somebody there who owns the suitcase who answers the question in that exact instant. So this dynamic of how networked communication on the internet can blow rumors out of proportion when there's a perfectly reasonable explanation, but that explanation won't necessarily go viral or won't hit in the same time frame, creates some interesting challenges, and that's where we try to talk about how we can best triage those claims so that the public can be informed.
So what, this kind of, for 2020 happened organically through the 2018 experience. And one of the cases that I recall, not in 2020, but 2018, was a state election official saw on a social media platform that the other party was claiming that the polls were closed, which was demonstrably false.
Yeah.
And it was propagating on social media. And what the election official wanted to do is like, hey, I want to flag this for the social media platform so that they can check it against terms of service and take action, or put a banner on it and say, hey, and that's that was kind of part of the genesis of the origination. In that case, it was actually a Democratic operative, and it was a Republican Secretary of State that made the notification. So this wasn't a Dems telling on Republicans. It was actually through 2020, that process and the workflows were actually very bipartisan. In fact, they were pretty much split 50-50 of very active use. And so to me, that's a sign of success. Now, that's not necessarily the story that always gets
No, there was
told,
a lot of, I remember a meme that Hillary Clinton posted to Instagram that had a wrong registration date for, I think it was maybe South Carolina, if I'm remembering correctly, and it was an election official in South Carolina who sent it in. It was like, this meme has the wrong date for, pre-registration or whatever it was, voter registration. Can somebody flag this so that Instagram can address it, can throw a label up on it? So these were the sorts of things that, it was really very mundane most of the time. It was, but to answer your question about what keeps me up, one of the problems that we have today, I think, is that it's delegitimization all the way down, right? It's not just the election that gets hit with the delegitimization narratives. It's also the idea that anyone who looks at election misinformation is part of a cabal or has a nefarious motive. It's that any election official that is trying to stand up for free and fair elections, independent of party or the country over party ethos that guided the republic for the up until now, is somehow a political operative. It's that nobody wants social media companies to look at misinformation, but they don't want the government to look, but they don't want academics to look, but they don't want civil society to look. So any type of actor in that multi-stakeholder model that has the capacity to look at any of these things is targeted for delegitimization, arguing that the mere act of looking is somehow an argument in favor of censoring free speech about election claims. And that's where we really are today. We've really hit a point where it's not a social media problem, it's a crisis of trust problem that has really devolved down to the point where nobody has the moral authority among a wide enough segment of the population to be seen as a legitimate, trustworthy investigator into the various rumors that argue that the elections themselves are illegitimate.
Which is the perfect tee up.
There you go.
Thank you.
I have a great day job. My day job is to hang out with people who are like 18 to 23. And that is so exciting and refreshing and keeps me hopeful and optimistic when very little else will. And so thank you, those of you who are that age and dare to hang around old guys like us. So one of the reasons it's so important to me is that when I was in your chair, right, when I was your age, I saw people my age stand up in front of tanks in Tiananmen Square. Not live, I saw it on TV. We had this new thing called CNN at the time. It was pretty amazing. It gave us an instant view into things happening around the world. So not only did I see people my age stand up in front of tanks in Tiananmen Square, I saw people my age tear the Berlin Wall down with their hands. It was amazing. It was amazing. Never thought I would see that. You know, I had been raised with a sense of fatalism that the world was locked into a story and a trust and a belief in democracy and a countervailing story and a trust, or at least a surrender, to autocracy or worse. And that seemed to be where we were as I was growing up, right? Where was the idealism? Where was the optimism? Well, the idealism was all local. Like, I happen to be blessed. I live in a country where almost everybody trusts in the process. Almost everybody understands if my side loses an election, that's okay, I'm gonna work harder, fight harder next time. Do a better job convincing the people next time. That was taken for granted. I mean, I don't wanna be too idealistic about it, but that really was the norm. It's no longer the norm. How did my country devolve to this moment in what may seem to you to be a long time, but actually in the scope of human history, a very short period of time between 1989 and now 33 years? How did we get this low? How did we get this frustrated? How did we lose our faith and our trust in each other, in our institutions, and in democracy itself? And we're sitting here in this room, in this rotunda, on these grounds, and we really are in the right place to ask this question, right? This is a temple to all those ideals. And I don't know that we ask this question deeply enough or often enough. And I know it's strange because, like, I'm supposed to be this person who talks and writes about tech companies and their effect on democracy and culture, et cetera, right? But what it really gets down to is the fact that we don't wax romantic about democracy anymore because we're so busy just trying to explain and defend and work around, right? And whack moles to figure out how to just keep the thing steady and stable and stop Nazis from marching through our neighborhoods or taking over our state government or our national government, to stop them from invading the Capitol building in the United States. I mean, that's where our energy is placed means we haven't taken the time to breathe deeply and think deeply and sing about democracy. And this is what I've been spending most of the last 2 years thinking about. I'm really sick of talking about Facebook. And I'm really sick about talking about YouTube and Google. There are smarter people than myself who are doing much better work on these problems. I said what I needed to say a few years ago, wrote a couple books. You know, the book I wrote about Facebook and how it's undermining democracy was, of course, set up, inspired by the US elections of 2016, where we all saw in clear language all of the maladies that have continued, in fact, in many ways gotten worse, right? The big lie of 2020 was established in the summer of 2016 when Donald Trump basically said the election was not going to be legitimate anyway, because he really didn't think he was going to win. And he set it up like nothing. He didn't change his line at all for 4 years. He surprised himself by becoming president in 2016 and somehow surprised himself by not being president in 2020. Who knows how that happened? Nonetheless, when I wrote that book, what was on my mind was not so much Donald Trump and Russian interference in the US election and all of those ancillary things that we paid so much attention to here. I had been inspired to look into that subject because when I was in my early 20s, another thing I saw was this thing called people power. People power, a woman named Cory Aquino, whose husband had been a dissident politician in the Philippines, standing up to the Marcos regime, had escaped a certain death and then returned to Manila to lead a mass protest movement to establish democracy in the Philippines. And the Philippines is one of the largest countries in the world, one of the most important countries in the world. We don't pay a lot of attention to. But that was a deeply inspirational moment in my youth, as inspirational as the protests in Tiananmen Square, which were ultimately a failure, and the protests in Berlin and in Budapest and in Gdansk, which were ultimately successes and deeply inspiring. But that protest in the Philippines made me think, oh my gosh, this is what's possible when people believe in democracy, believe in each other, and believe in what's possible. And then what happened right before the election in the US in 2016? The Philippines elected an authoritarian leader who explicitly opposed democracy, and then re-elected his party just last year. What happened in India in 2014 is the largest democracy in the world elected a person who does not believe in democracy, who does not believe in a pluralistic society, who does not believe in tolerance, who believes in state-sponsored terrorism. And India is devolving very fast, right? So in this very short period of time, I watched what happened. I watched democracy go away in the Philippines, democracy basically go away in India, democracy just a few months before the November 2016 elections in the US. I saw the people of Brazil vote democracy away. They might get it back in a few weeks, but that was scary. And so I'm looking at those three places that when I was in my youth, I had great hopes in, because they had made the turn to democracy. And then in a very short period of time, 30 years or 30 years plus, had turned against it. What made people in those countries turn against it? Brazil, a country where so many people living there have the living memory of living under a fascist military dictatorship, and they turned against democracy? There's something deeper going on there. Now, I'm the first to admit that we should pay attention to the power of social media and the twists of our media ecosystem overall to amplify all sorts of noxious expression. But that's not all there was, because there was an illness ready to be amplified, right? The virus was spreading already. And we really need to dig deep and figure that out. So where are we now? We're now in a situation in this country of all countries where we don't have a romance of democracy, where we don't have in our ears, in our minds, the poetry of Walt Whitman, the booming rhythms of Aaron Copland, the swinging rhythms of democracy. We don't have something that moves us to believe deeply in the power of each other, right? In the shared future that we all have, whether we admit it or not. And instead, the major sounds echoing from the United States are about fearing each other, fearing our neighbors, fearing our new neighbors, fearing religious minorities, fearing sexual minorities, fearing gender minorities, fearing. And there is no embrace of the strength of us together. And I think that's what we need more than anything. Because one of the things we think a lot about is like, how can we filter better? How can we turn down the volume of all the ugly expression and the expression that undermines democracy? And of course, we know we can't and should not explicitly censor, especially with the power of the government. That's right off the table. But all that's left then is to sing louder. So those of us who believe in democracy have to sing louder than those who oppose it. Sing louder than they yell. And I think that has to be our mission. How do we do that? I haven't a clue, right? But that's what I'm focusing on mostly right
and
now.
as you're pointing out, that goes beyond the U.S. because I just returned from Italy.
Absolutely.
And as we were driving around, I asked our driver, what do you think of your new president? And his response was, well, we have a lot of problems here, and, we kind of needed a strong man. He goes, well, I know she's a woman, but we needed a strong man. And so that, that lean towards fascism predated any social media.
Absolutely. It was always
whether
there.
it was here or there, and
Right.
and that's a lot of what's going on. To get back to the Carrie Lake problem, and when you see where she's going, and you get a little bit different face on it than some of these other people. So that is the bigger problem, and it's a laziness of those who don't want to do the work of democracy, whether it's the going and working at the polls or realizing, gosh, I worked so hard and I won this election, but gee, I still need to get 50 plus 1
That's
to
right.
get my bill passed.
That's right.
Because every year when people win, and this is both sides, having seen, well, we won this election, but Joe Biden didn't do everything he said he was going to do. It's like, well, guess what? It's a 50-50 country. Nobody can do that. And then when whoever wins an election, they never can do, when it's 50-50, you can't do everything. This is what we said we want to do. But you still have to get the votes to do it,
Right.
and that's a messy business. So you don't get everything you're in a democracy. But then when you have a strong man authoritarianism, then they like that because, oh, that's easy. If I get 50 plus 1, I can do everything I want and wipe your team off the map. And that's where these people are all leaning, whether it's a left authoritarian or a right, and that's what's scary right now around the world.
We should celebrate. We should slap high fives when our people win and take control and are able to execute the policy choices that we prefer. That's all good and that's all fair. But more importantly, we should all get chills when we vote, no matter whether we're going to win or not, right? We should actually take a moment when you vote and realize what that act means, what people have sacrificed to give you the ability to do that, what signal you're sending to your fellow citizens at that moment. And again, that means being slower, thinking more, feeling more. We really need to feel more about democracy, not just analyze it better and think better, but truly deeply feel it, right? When I used to work the polls when I lived in Texas. Now, when I lived in Texas, my candidates rarely won. That was okay. I worked the polls every election because I loved it. I loved making sure that system worked. I loved smiling at people as they came in. I loved encouraging them to feel proud of this little act they were doing, the time they were taking out of their day to make this statement and to say, yeah, I'm part of something bigger. I'm part of a whole cloth. And again, these are not messages that echo right now in America. They're latent. We all recognize them when we take the time to think about them. And we're not the only place that feels them, but we are, whether we like it or not, a model for the world, both positive and negative. And I fear that when we take these things for granted, we send messages to the rest of the world, it's okay to take it for granted as well. Because Americans don't care about democracy anymore, why should we? And I think that's doubly dangerous, because then we have all kinds of problems washing back at us.
So what I've long believed, and it was part of kind of the philosophy or the mindset in preparing for the 2020 election, is that the real point of an election is to convince not the winner they won, but the loser that they lost.
That's right.
But the underlying assumption in that argumentation is you have two good faith actors, that they will accept the evidence. And I think where we are right now is, in part, we may not have good actors on both sides. You mentioned Carrie Lake. We also have Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania that has said that he would decertify the 2020 election, which is not a thing, by the way. There is no such thing as decertifying elections. Right. So it means nothing. But it all kind of backs up to, if you have people that are in positions of influence, elites or influencers, that continue to move orthogonal to democracy, kind of to your point, is there a countermeasure here? I can think tactically of how to increase trust in elections through additional paper ballots. So from 2016, it was about 70% of ballots or votes cast in the election had a paper ballot associated with it. That went all the way up to 95% in 2020, in part due to investments by Congress, retiring some old legacy machines. In fact, Virginia retired some of their touchscreen devices. But also COVID. There was actually more mail-in ballots used. The entire state of New Jersey switched from touchscreens to a mail-in ballot process. So tactically, more paper, more post-election audits. We've got to do more of that. More transparency from election officials. I think that's a really interesting dynamic that shifted so dramatically in the last couple of years, was that election officials are kind of used to operating below the radar, just getting the election done, not causing too much trouble. Election equipment manufacturers, election vendors, the same thing, stay out of the headlines. Now they are on the front page. They are in massive multi-billion-dollar lawsuits. And so they have to be much more strategic in communications, engagement. Stephen Richer, the Republican recorder in Maricopa County, Arizona, uses radical transparency in how the election process works. Okay, we can do that tactically. Strategically, though, I'm with you a little bit, and I'm not sure I understand how, once these narratives manifest, how you effectively counter them, because the point is not to convince you that any single thing is true. I mean, the 2000 Mules movie has been debunked thoroughly, front to back.
That's right.
Time and time again.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Republican Attorney General of Arizona just referred True the Vote to the IRS and the FBI for a criminal referral.
So that when we look at things on the truth-false axis, we miss like 90% of the story, right? We can talk forever, and we've all been in these conversations about misinformation and disinformation and how it's a malady, which it is. But think about all the other forms of expression that aren't quite disinformation or misinformation that are just as caustic to undermining democracy. You have to include harassment, both individual and organized harassment against actors, whether the four of us or a journalist or an activist or anybody, right? Harassment is a big part of it. Then you have to add half-truths, which are often important parts of conspiracy theories. You have to add out-of-context truths. Things that are true, but placed in a different context, can completely twist the story. And every major conspiracy theory includes half-truths, out-of-context truths, and falsities. And to the point where it's not about saying, I'm going to convince you of something that is not true, and you're going to believe it's true. It's about sowing doubt in everything. Once you sow doubt in everything, you sow doubt in trust. And especially trust in institutions that certify. That could be scientific communities, medical communities, it could be political scientists, it could be Congress, it could be the Securities and Exchange Commission, right? It could be the Federal Election Commission, any of these things you can sow doubt onto. And that is really what we're facing right now. And so for that reason, we really have to get beyond the question of let's address the falsehoods. It is much more about the whole fabric. You know, one of the biggest ways you can express something and undermine democracy is to just ask questions. Because there are a lot of bad faith questions that I'm just asking questions about, right? I'm just asking questions about whether there is a suitcase full of ballots sitting outside.
There used to be, I study influence and propaganda. That's kind of how I contextualize my work increasingly at this point. But in the 1930s, there was a prominent influencer on the radio by the name of Father Coughlin, right? And he had about 30 million listeners, which if you think about the average social media influencer, it's like a fraction of that. But what was so interesting about Father Coughlin, and so he, I'm not going to go into the politics right now, but kind of like moved in a pretty fascist direction as the U.S. was the interwar period between World War I and World War II. But I've been going through these old archives of both the U.S. government response, and then also there's actually a group of academics, kind of like an NGO almost, called the Institute for Propaganda Analysis. And what it did was it did research into Father Coughlin's speeches that did not really attempt to debunk or fact check or correct, but it instead attempted to explain to the American people how it worked. Mm-hmm. And you read these archives, I mean, they're absolutely extraordinary. It's like, we like use emoji in casual conversation. They literally made 7 emoji, several little images reflecting different rhetorical techniques of propaganda. And when you read through these books, they're intended to be used in high schools and colleges. They're just annotating in there. It's like, here's the speech, here's the transcription, and here in line, we're just going to put the emoji that ties into the particular propaganda rhetorical technique that he's using. And the goal is to make people actually recognize not that the claim is false, but that here is how the rhetoric works, here is how propaganda actually works. And I think that there's really something interesting about that. As we sit here, so much of what we saw in 2020 and so much of what we're seeing in 2022, we study elections now. We were doing this project on vaccines last year. And again, there too, the claims are identical to the kind of claims you see during like smallpox variolation. And that's because they're emotionally resonant. They tap into real fears. They tap into real concerns. And so instead of fact checking the particular instance at the particular point in time, I do think that at a more systemic level, like what I've been so struck by as I read these archives from the 1930s, is that they were not trying to waste their time whack-a-moling random bullshit. Instead, what they were doing is they were saying, here is how this works. Here is how it works. And I am really intrigued by the idea of like bringing back that kind of education at a high school level. Not media literacy so much as like, here is how you fact check something on the internet, but more here is how we think about what persuasive communication looks like, who has influence, and how it works.
Of course, the 15-year-olds aren't the problem, it's the 50-year-olds.
Right, exactly, yes.
So.
AARP could just sit there and like do it in their magazine.
So this was actually interesting. We did a couple different engagements in the run-up to the 2020 election. The first probably notable one was in 2019, the summer of 2019. We at CISA released an infographic called The War on Pineapple.
Pizza,
And
yeah, the pineapple pizza one.
Right. So basically the idea here was to break down how an online influence operation works in 5 steps. And we could not pick a politically contentious issue because the actual fight or flight mechanism would kick in and you'd immediately, just due to tribal politics, whatever, you'd turn it off and you wouldn't. So instead the team went out to lunch and they were trying to figure out what's something that's binary. And they were working through, is it salt and vinegar chips? You either hate them or you love them. I love them. Is it cilantro? Some people think it tastes like kerosene. What they actually landed on being the most binary love it or hate it issue is Hawaiian pizza.
Oh, yeah.
Pineapple and ham on a pizza. You either love it or you hate it. I hate it. Anyway, but the point was to take that as the meme and break it down into the 5 components of an online influence campaign. The first is identify the issue. Second is get your accounts into place. So this is online, this is social media, this is Twitter, this is Facebook. The third is start to move into position and amplify, right? Start getting it into position on the platforms and into the groups and start getting traction and engagement on high-vis platforms. The fourth is get it mainstream. Get that hop from a Twitter into the Washington Post, New York Times, Fox, CNN, whatever. And the fifth, and this is what happened, as I think back to 2020, where January 6th was entirely predictable, take it into the real world. So it's not just online, it's not just on TV, but you have people that are acting on the seed of the campaign. And so we kicked that off, and it was actually a campaign that we launched with the National Association of Secretaries of State and the National Association of State Election Directors. And so they were pitting each other, they were going against each other, pepperoni or whatever. We were actually in violation of the Twitter policies as a result, because it was all inauthentic behavior effectively. But nonetheless, it was a great explainer. And I think to your point, we need more of that. We need more thinking about giving people the tools to be successful. You will never scale to hit every theme or every issue. Right. We tried that. We tried that with rumor control, which is another thing we launched in 2020, which basically we stole from FEMA. So after every hurricane, FEMA has evidence that scammers and grifters come into Florida and Georgia and North Carolina and try to prey on people to get access to their individual assistance. So you get money after a disaster, grifters, scammers want to get that money. Or you'll have other people come in and try to clear your debris or change your roof out. They're not licensed. So FEMA developed a page called Rumor Control. It said, you may hear this, here's the truth. We took that and flipped the model and said, here are the controls in place, kind of to your point, and then here's what you might hear. But one claim was that there was a CIA supercomputer and software that was flipping votes at a fractional count in state tabulators. So of course I'm not going to say that's just dumb. It is dumb. It doesn't make sense. but our approach was like, I'm going to stipulate to this that it's true. All right, let's just stipulate that it's true. Let me tell you why that couldn't happen in the real world. Because I got a ballot for every vote. And then when I audit that election, when I audit the count after the election, I don't care if there's a supercomputer flipping votes. I'm recounting the ballots. Georgia performed some form of a recount or an audit 3 times in the wake of the 2020 election with physical ballots. So even if there was a CIA supercomputer, it would have gotten caught prior to certification. But guess what? There was no difference. And in fact, when a team came into Arizona, which for some reason is just like the nexus of all election conspiracy theories, or the gate to hell, I don't know what you want to call it. But they actually brought in an outside unqualified firm to conduct an audit, and they actually found more votes for Biden than they thought going into it. So even the fake audit confirmed the election, and that there is no Chinese hackers coming in through thermostats or Italian satellite. Did you check on that when you were in Italy last week? Did you confirm that? But again, it's just, and just to be clear, right? The the CISA and FBI, so the agency I led and the FBI 2 weeks ago issued an alert that very conclusively said they're not aware of any actor today, yesterday, 5 years ago that has the ability to change a vote tabulation, or prevent you from voting. It's just not going to happen. And I also think that it would be incredibly not just difficult to do that in an undetected manner, it would also be very unwise.
Yeah. It's a waste of time.
It's a waste of time, and I'm also fairly certain that would be considered an act of war.
Right.
And that our military would not take that
And the people
very.
in the state legislature in Arizona, most of them don't believe any of this nonsense either.
It's all performative.
It is just a performance because they were afraid of it. I mean, the Speaker of the House who testified, that he was being terrorized by Trump, and then he lost his seat. But what was her name? Karen Fan, who ended up going along with it. She knew that wasn't true, and then she ended up not even running for re-election because at the end of the day, she had to kind of, hey, I can't, this isn't going anywhere, and she finally just wouldn't keep going along with the grift, and now the Attorney General has said, he turned it over, and also a lot of the Republicans who initially went along with it finally had to say, okay, no, I'm not going to totally be a criminal and keep going along with this. Not that Carrie Lake won't continue to go along with it, but so there just isn't, there's no there there.
Well, this is where you see the big if true also, for your
Yeah.
point. Like, well, we would see big if true at pivotal inflection points. Like on Sharpiegate, for example, there were people who really sincerely believed it, right? There are many, many people who see it as like this, how could this possibly not have gone my way? Something must have gone wrong. It must have been that. Yeah. Or in that moment, at that time, right at the poll, they receive the Sharpie marker and they think like, there's, something's weird about this. I'm not supposed to use Sharpies on a Scantron. But what you see is like that generally stays at like people who are willing to make declarative statements, articulating that they sincerely believe the thing that they are saying. I believe my ballot was, not read because of this Sharpie marker, like that actual claim. These are usually fairly small accounts, but what you start to see, the big if true is the amplifier. They don't want to stake their reputation on saying there has been voter fraud in Arizona and this is how it happened. What they do is they grab those tweets and they throw big if true on top of it and they retweet it. And so it is just, it is almost like teaching people to recognize particular rhetoric. I feel like big if true or the they, who the hell is they? Like fill it out. Come on, like tell me who they is when you're making this claim,
false,
right?
Then they just kind of crawl away like, okay, then they're afraid of this crowd.
They also don't want to
that
get sued
created.
depending on who they're, who they're going to point at.
Let's also remember that a lot of people believe things that, we in this room might consider wacky, out of line, and just beyond belief.
What, JFK Jr. is coming back, right?
Something like right,
Yeah.
but they often adopt those things because it's an identity process, an identity formation and maintenance process. It's a way of enlisting in a club, in a group, and saying, I'm the sort of person who believes this because I want to be that sort of person. I want to be in this group of people. I want to be trusted by this group of people. I want connections with this group of people. And it might be that you're in what we might call a cult. It might be that you're in a particular political party, right? Something that's not quite a cult. It might be that you want to believe things that we might be able to explode upon deep inspection. But it's so deeply important to you to keep believing this thing because it's part of how you establish rich bonds with others, mutuality with others. And when you talk to people who've been in cults and got out of cults, that's what really got them into it. Ultimately, it wasn't about whether the message of the cult or the leader of the cult was telling the truth. It was about the sense of being someone and belonging. And when we lose that in other parts of our lives, when we feel alienated, when we feel atomized, we're very susceptible to those sorts of things. So that is one of the deep undercurrents going on, not just in American society, but globally. It's one of the reasons why none of the things we're talking about up here are American. We saw them in Poland, we saw them in Hungary, we've seen them in Sweden. Sweden just elected a right-wing coalition led by a fascist party. Italy is now being led by fascists, right? These are countries that should know better, right? These are highly educated, wealthy countries with relatively few problems. And yet they all have, throughout their society, such a deep sense of alienation that people are susceptible to believing almost anything and aligning themselves regardless of what the evidence says.
I think, unfortunately our time's at an end, but I think that's an interesting way to close the conversation as we see, deglobalization, political deglobalization. I mean, the last 2-3 weeks alone in the way the U.S. has reacted to Chinese industrial policy, particularly in the technology and semiconductor sectors, has been remarkable. I mean, 2 weeks of policy shifts has undone years and years and years of industrial integration. And then once Xi comes out of the third-party Congress, it's going to be a wild ride, I think, towards the end of the year. But to kind of the broader point of where does this all go? I think we've all laid out, I think, a number of risk areas. I think there are a lot of unknowables. Kind of to your point on how this is it's not necessarily an information to a platform issue. I do think that when we've ultimately, the historians write the full book on COVID, whatever that looks like, the psychological aspects will be really important to understand, and because how we withdrew from community. To the joke I make about JFK Jr. coming back, so that was like a QAnon conspiracy theory over the summer that JFK Jr. was in fact alive, and that he was going to reemerge in Dallas, and that he would be a running mate of either Biden or Trump. The conspiracy theory changes in 24, both, right? Maybe he would just run. But the way that through COVID, withdrawing from community, normally when you'd go to, a kid's soccer practice or a school meeting or synagogue or whatever it is, there's a community moderating effect where you would think twice before saying, hey, I heard JFK Jr. is back and I'm going to go see him in Dallas. Somebody's like, are you insane? I mean, that might be true, but you usually don't say those things. But through social media platforms and other outlets, you find that affinity group, that community that whether it's identity, tribalism, or whatever, or maybe just some people's need for conspiracy theory hunting. But we have quite a challenge in front of us. I think maybe just close it out real quick with 22 election is a couple weeks away. If there's one prediction you have from a how things could go wrong perspective, what might it be?
Take it real dark at the end here.
I'm happy to start. I will start, I'll give everybody breathing room. So my biggest concern is partly for 22, but primarily the effect of a 2020 outcome on 2024. And so there are at least 3 secretaries of state or secretaries that may be installed that are either going to be appointed or they would be elected into a position, and they have either said, as the Congresswoman said earlier on, that the 2020 outcome was illegitimate, and that they may do something in that run-up to 24 to deliver an outcome that may not actually be the will of the people. We have a candidate for Secretary of State in Arizona, Mark Finchem, when he was asked if it was possible for President Biden to win Arizona, and his remark was that it was a fantasy land. You had the governor the other night say, or rather on Sunday, I believe it was on Face the Nation, or State of the Union rather, CNN, that she couldn't possibly entertain losing this election. So we have a crisis of confidence in democracy, and those that we're entrusting with administering democracy may not necessarily hold the same kind of objective truths as we do. So that's my biggest concern, is that the outcomes of 22 will only pose a greater risk to 24.
And we have a Secretary of State candidate, I think, in Nevada. And
Jim Archant in Nevada, you have
and
Kristen
then Michigan, but probably
in
won't
Michigan.
win. Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
he probably won't get to a point one, so we're probably safe there. So yeah, those are certainly big concerns of mine too. But I do think things are so volatile, so I'm not in the prediction business anymore. So I do think when you see the economy is so bad, I do think it probably will revert to what people think when the economy is bad, that the party out of power will do better. But I do think because of the volatility and because things are so unusual, get engaged, get out there. I'm one of the things we didn't even talk about that distresses me more than ever is, the lack of character in so many of these characters who are running for office. I mean, the people don't even care at all, when you see some of these people and the stories that come up and nobody cares. Oh, no, we don't care about this or that or the other. And the hypocrisy.
You can just get through, if I can just get through a news cycle,
yeah,
I'll be fine.
Yeah, and then everybody's like, wait, you used to care about that? No, we don't, and here's another 10 million. So it's just horrific on that front. So I think whoever wins, there's going to be a huge downgrade of the quality of people in Congress, which is why it makes it even more important the things that are going on elsewhere, I think in the business community, in your communities, in the State House, and you're being involved and engaged in getting a hold of what's going on elsewhere. So whatever happens, whoever wins, there's going to be divided government and a stalemate, which may in many cases be a good thing, because the people who are going to end up being there, in many cases, you don't want them doing anything.
I think it's the scattered political violence risk, potentially. Like that's, as we saw a lot of very heated protests when people were, the kind of some of the Stop the Steal protests. Of course, January 6th was the biggest, but there were other kind of smaller protests, and just did kind of feel like since there was, actual violence on the 6th, that shifted a norm, and I'm hoping that we don't see the perpetuation of that shifted norm in this election.
Yeah, and there had been other violence at state capitals prior to.
That's right.
And then what was it today? Was it Georgia or Ohio that announced the election threat alert line? Oh. So I mean, these are.
I was thinking about Michigan, where to build on Renee's point, or Michigan, where there was basically an invasion of the state capitol and a plot to kidnap the governor, and yeah, it failed, but the next one might not, and some governor might get kidnapped or assassinated. I mean, it's entirely possible, feasible. So yeah, Renee took mine. That was going to be my big fear. Look, again, yeah, we're in this temple to democracy, but we're also overlooking the lawn where Nazis marched in 2017. Their footprint's still out there. The smell's still in the air, right? We haven't escaped that. I have friends who haven't recovered from that moment. And that was all, we saw it here. We saw it here long before January 6, 2021. We saw it right here. It could happen at any moment, anywhere in the country. And it could happen again and again and again at a low level that people might not panic about. It could happen at a massive level, which causes massive dislocation. The other things I worry about actually are like that, Bolsonaro wins in Brazil. I worry, I have weird worries, right? I worry that, there's this nuclear power, formerly powerful, rich nation in the North Atlantic, used to be called the United Kingdom. It's kind of disunited now. No one knows who's running it right now. There's deep, deep anger among every segment of that society. The people there are suffering massively from a bunch of really bad policy decisions made by their leaders and by their voters. And we don't know what's going to happen with that country. We don't know what is going to come out of the turbulence in the next 24 months in that country. We always assume that country's pretty stable. I got to say, it looks really unstable right now. I think Mexico's a lot more stable than the United Kingdom is right now. And it really worries me because, again, this is a nuclear power. We don't know what happens if Europe gets weirder, right? We don't know if Italy's going to back out on supporting NATO as it supports Ukraine. That could happen. And then Hungary could follow, and Poland could follow. We don't know if any other big part of Europe is going to pull out of supporting Ukraine. And then a lot of things get really bad. So, hey, I'm Mr. Cheerful.
Yeah. Well,
I am more optimistic, and I did think of something good that I forgot.
Good,
That I do have
us.
a good prediction that hopefully will put a smile on everyone's face. Okay, this Friday, Steve Bannon will be sentenced, and he'll be going to jail. So one good thing, yeah. And post-election, I believe Donald Trump will be indicted also. So, and I think that is important for the system. And for justice and for the beginning, because I do hear some people who think, no, we can't do that. I think that will happen, and I think it will happen without a lot of tumult. I think when Trump's, when everybody on Fox had a meltdown in August, and they said, there's been they went in and they took his documents and they tried to, Fox News basically tried to start a riot over that, and everyone was on vacation and said, nope, I'm going back to the beach and I'm going to have my cocktails, and I'm really not that upset about it. So, and I think that's what will happen when Donald Trump is indicted. So I have a little bit more faith that things will come back together again, and a lot of this nonsense will be seen for what it is. I'm very concerned about the authoritarian things and all those too, but I think when people see a Kari Lake or see these things a little bit more stark, sometimes people have to actually hit the wall before they're like, okay, that was really a bad idea.
Yeah.
Why did we do that? And then they wake up and say, yep, bad idea. Let's get back to normal. So I think things like that are good will happen.
So we've held you all over for overtime. I apologize for that, but I think, look, so just on that last point of up until the Mar-a-Lago reclamation of classified documents, I was on the fence probably for indictment, kind of weeble-wobbling back and forth. But for that one, after being in the national security community for 20 plus years, I'm like, oh, you do not mishandle classified documents like that. That, you go straight to jail. Yeah. And that, I think that kind of iced it for me. But to the bigger point, I think, as we've heard, is that yes, we have an important moment in American democracy coming up in November 22 and then 24 beyond that. But what's as equally as important is the role of American leadership of democracy globally. I'm not talking about nation building, but democracy is in retreat globally. It is quantifiable effectively, and democracy takes work. So again, I applaud everybody for coming out. Thank you for coming out, spending your afternoon and evening with us. Get out there, do what you need to continue the American experiment. Thank you.
Hey.